Well, good evening, everyone. We're sorry for the slight delay. We had some technical issues we needed to resolve before going on air, but now we're here. And also good to see that we have a good number of attendees today as well. So I guess the COP cancellation freed you for some of your duties, so you could attend to this webinar. So good to know. So welcome to the second webinar in the series of unfolding the reporting requirements for the developing countries under the Paris Agreement's Enhanced Transparency Framework. I'm Federico. I work for the UNEP partnership here in Copenhagen, and I will be the moderator for today's webinar as well. So today we'll take a deeper dive into the information that goes into the biennial transparency report. And this webinar can also be viewed independently from the first one, but if you couldn't participate in the previous webinar or you would like to revisit it, you can always access the recording of the webinar on our website, the UNEP partnerships website. So the webinar for today will be, again, 1 hour long, including time for questions and answers. And after the webinar, you'll be able to find all the material online on the UNEP partnerships website as well. So before we move on, again, I would like to inform you that we comply with the GDPR, the General Data Protection Act, and for access to your data or further information, you're also welcome to contact the UNEP partnership. Over to today's speakers, who you already know from last time, is Mirko del Maso, Program Associate here at the UNEP partnership, and myself, Federico Antonio Canu, Project Officer. We are also the main authors of the publication upon which the webinar is inspired. And again, we will have a Q&A session at the end. And we will go through a lot of material and a lot of information. But you can write us the questions during the presentations as they arise, and we will try to the best of our capacities to answer as many as we can by the end of it. And hopefully we will not go over time too much. So over to the content of the presentation of today. It's divided in the general aspects of the biennial transparency reports. Then we'll go through some of the information required and the changes for the National Inventory report or greenhouse gas inventories. Then the information on NDC tracking. Then information on adaptation, communication, and climate change impacts and adaptation, and then information on support needed and received. So before we take our deep dive into the biennial transparency report, which, by the way, from now on I will call BTR for short, because it's a name that we'll mention a lot of times. So BTR is the biennial transparency report. But now we'll go quickly through a recap of the previous webinar just to provide some context. So the objective of the Enhanced Transparency Framework established by Article 13 of the Paris Agreement is, if you remember from the last time, its objective is twofold. On one side, it is to provide clarity on climate action, and on the other side, it is to provide clarity on support provided and received. This is to build mutual trust and confidence amongst parties and to promote effective implementation. So the purpose of the framework for transparency of action is to provide a clear understanding of the climate change action in the light of the Paris Agreement's objective of limiting global warming by 2 degrees and pursuing efforts to limit it by 1.5 degrees by the end of the century, and to provide clarity and tracking of progress towards achieving the country's individual NDCs, the nationally determined contributions, to inform the global stocktake, and to periodically take stock of the implementation of the Paris Agreement. So that's on the action side. The purpose of the framework for transparency of support is to provide clarity on support provided and received by relevant individual parties related to both mitigation, adaptation, and financial, technology, and capacity building support. And to the extent possible, also provide a full overview of aggregate financial support provided to inform the global stocktake. And that is basically why we have the BTR. That's a reporting vehicle for all this information. So the BTR is the main reporting vehicle under the ETF, the Enhanced Transparency Framework, which I will call ETF from now, providing information on the status and expected emissions, actions, and support. So the first BTR is to be submitted by the end of 2024, the latest, and will be submitted every 2 years following the first submission. So developing countries have some flexibility on the level of detail of the information to be reported and on some other aspects. And LDCs, the least developed countries, and SIDS, the small island development states, they can submit the BTR at their discretion. Although when submitting a BTR, the modalities, procedures, and guidance will have to be followed. So even though LDCs and SIDS can submit at their discretion, they will have to follow the requirements laid out in the MPGs. And also, if flexibility is applied, the use of it must be specifically explained, and plans and deadlines must be developed to meet the requirements. So that's aiming at achieving the continuous quality of improvements over time. Then we have the National Inventory Report. In other words, the GHG inventory needs to be submitted together with the BTR, but can also be submitted as a detached report. It doesn't need to go into the same report, but the frequency of reporting is the same. The BTR can also be used by countries as a vehicle to submit adaptation communication. And adaptation communication can also be submitted with other communications, such as the NDC, the national communications, or national adaptation plans. So that's the recap from the last webinar. I will now give the word over to Mirko, that will take a deeper look into the ETF requirements related to the national inventory reports.
Thank you very much, Federico. Yes, good evening also from my side, or good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are. Yes, we proceed now with the National Inventory Report, which we call here NIR, which is the key report to communicate on the current and past greenhouse gas emissions of the country. The guidelines on the requirements for the NIR are also contained in the MPGs, more specifically in Chapter 2, as you see in the figure. And now we will go through some of them, which are gathered in this table that you see in the slide. So the column in the middle is the one that gathers all the requirements for the National Inventory Report, which was part of and is still part of the biennial update report. So the report under the transparency report under the convention, while the column on the right refers to the NIR as part of the BTR. So the requirements under the Paris Agreement, just to be clear. So we do this to try to give you a perspective into how the requirements have changed from the convention to the Paris Agreement. And as we have explained, the MPGs are a common document for all parties, and so is the guidance for national inventories, which is part of it. In this and the following table, you will see some of the requirements that are highlighted in blue, and these are the requirements for which flexibility applies. While the ones that you see in italics characters, they are the ones that are should, encouraged, and may requirements. So basically the ones that are not mandatory. Starting with the reporting form, so the first row of the table, the reporting form under the BUR, it's basically, it has changed. And it used to be composed of a reporting part and the greenhouse gas inventory, while under the new framework, we have this division on the national inventory document and the common reporting tables, which will be made available from next year. The submission requirements have also changed, and we have moved from a should requirement to a shall requirement, as you can see in the table. So now the submission with the BTR is mandatory. The IPCC guidelines, which have to be used in order to compile this inventory, have also changed, although it's just a formal change. So it used to be the guidelines from '96, which were recommended, and now the 2006 guidelines are the ones that are recommended, or any following versions. And we know that this year, for example, the new version of the IPCC guidelines have been released in May. Going a bit more into the substance of the inventory, we have the gases which have to be reported, and there we have shifted from 3 to 7 gases that shall be reported, so the mandatory gases. However, for the new requirements, if flexibility is needed, countries can choose to report at least the first 3 gases, which are carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. Finally, the last row of this table shows that under the Paris Agreement, countries will have to identify key categories from the starting and last year of the inventory. What is a key category? A key category is basically a category that is prioritized within the inventory because it's estimated to have a significant influence on a country's national total inventory. And how do we decide that it has a high influence? Basically, there is a threshold of 95%. So altogether, the key categories should cover at least 95% of the total level of emissions. The new addition in this sense in the new framework is that if flexibility is needed, countries can use 85% as a threshold instead of the 95%. So for each category, countries should also actually provide individual and cumulative contribution and the level and trend for the first and last reporting year. So this is the remaining part of the table, and we proceed with this. So first is about the time series, and while before time series were not a mandatory requirement, now countries will be asked to report consistent annual time series from 1990, and the latest reporting year is to be no more than 2 years prior to the submission of the BTR. And if flexibility is needed, again, countries can instead choose to report data covering at a minimum the reference year for the NDC and the period of the NDC, and a consistent annual time series from at least 2020 onwards. And I think I will not go through all the other points, but the take-home message is basically that requirements in general change from should or encourage into shall, but they still leave some flexibility so that countries can, for example, only discuss qualitatively the uncertainty instead of quantitatively, and have larger margin for this completeness check and considering or not considering some emissions. And finally, if you look at the last row, this is another important point actually. Countries have to describe these institutional arrangements that are made for the estimation, compilation, and reporting of the national inventory reports. And now I give the word back to Federico for the rest.
So thank you for that thorough presentation of the changes of the requirements respecting the GHG inventories. So now moving over to the content of the BTR, which you might be less familiar with because it presents new aspects that have come into play with the Paris Agreement. And it's basically the information related to the information needed to track progress of the NDCs. So the MPGs, if you remember from the last webinar, stands for the modalities, procedures, and guidance to the ETF. And it presents the details outlining the operationalization of the ETF. And they provide a guidance on the relevant information on NDC tracking to be reported in the BTR. In these overall 6 elements that you see here highlighted, and that's the national circumstances, the description of the NDC, then the specific information to track progress on the NDC, then information on mitigation policies and measures, including adaptation with mitigation co-benefits and economic diversification plans. Then a summary of GHG emissions and removals is requested, and then actually also projections of GHG emissions and removals. And as I said during the last webinar, the conventional reporting was more focused on current and past emissions and actions, while the ETF basically takes a more prospective look and requires country to look more into the future. So we start with the national circumstances, and the MPGs require information on the national circumstances and how the country's national circumstances affect the GHG emissions and removals over time. And this information includes, as listed in the table, the government structure, population profile, geographical profile, economic profile, climate profile, and sector details. But some consideration about how these circumstances affect GHG emissions and removals should be included. And although not specifically requested by the conventions, other reporting vehicles like the National Communications or BURs, I mean, this information has, I mean, is also relevant and has also surely been included in the formal reporting by the countries. Although with the NDCs, new important aspects become relevant to report. So countries are now requested to provide information on the institutional arrangements in place to track progress made in implementing and achieving NDCs. And when describing these arrangements, also countries shall provide information on legal, institutional, administrative, and procedural arrangements for domestic implementation, monitoring, reporting, archiving of information, and also stakeholder engagement related to the implementation and achievement of the NDC. So it's a long list of information actually, and it was not as detailed in the previous guidance for reporting under the convention. So in addition, with Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, that's the market mechanism, basically countries have the opportunity to participate in cooperative approaches and basically trade emissions and emission reductions. So countries participating in these cooperative approaches should describe their institutional arrangements for tracking internationally transferred mitigation outcomes, or ITMOs for short. And they will also have to provide some sort of emission balance with emissions by sources and removals by sinks covered by the NDC, and adjusted with an addition for ITMOs transferred and subtractions for ITMOs used and acquired. And this actually is something that will spill over into the inventory as well. So also countries have to describe how each cooperative approach promotes sustainable development and ensures environmental integrity and transparency, including governance, and applies robust accounting to ensure the avoidance of double counting. And finally, future changes in institutional arrangements should be reported in the BTR. Yeah, and if you have unchanged information, they can also be referred to previous BTRs. So you don't need to replicate all information or repeat the same information subsequently for every BTR. We now move over to the description of the NDC. The description of the NDC is basically there to provide clarity of the NDC and the context between the NDC and the BTR, and basically which parameters that are used to track the implementation of the NDC, including basically the targets and description of the targets. And I mean, I don't know if you have read many different NDCs, but the different targets that have been submitted can take many forms and shapes. So some countries have submitted economy-wide absolute emission reductions, some have submitted emission intensity reductions, other emission reductions below business as usual scenarios, or just a description of mitigation co-benefits of other actions. So the target description also need to specify this kind of information, and also the target year or periods, and if it's a single year or multi-year target, the reference points, the baselines, and the respective values, and also the time frame for implementation, and also the scope and coverage. So relevant sectors, categories, what kind of activities, sources and sinks, and pools and gases. So this is information that should be in the NDC and basically repeated in the BTR to provide the context of the information that comes later on the information necessary to track the progress and achievement. And this section should also provide information if there is an intention to use cooperative approaches under Article 6 towards achieving the NDC. And potentially also information on clarification of previously reported information. So now we move over to the information necessary to track progress on the NDCs. And basically and I will go through what this table shows. So it looks kind of complex, but I'll take you through it step for step. So basically to track NDC progress and achievement, basically how we are performing, we need NDC targets, and the targets we have explained previously, but we also need indicators. And these are the core of the NDC description on how to track it. So different types of targets and indicators can be used based on the different target types that you have. So here we basically have divided it into the following. So absolute emission reductions, it's a kind of target that is easily translatable into an indicator of net GHG emissions and removals. And it can be expressed in a national GHG emission target for a future year. It could be 2025 or 2030, and expressed in relation to a base year or period. So it could be 1990 or 2005. So you have the base year, you have the target year, and you have the indicator. So these are the three elements which are important to have. For targets involving emission intensity reduction, the target is expressed as basically national GHG intensity, so GHG emissions per unit of GDP or per capita. And this could be translated into an indicator of percentage of reduction of GHG emission per unit of GDP, for instance. Emission reductions below a project baseline, it can basically be tracked by net GHG emissions and removals, but the difference from the absolute emission reduction is that we here need to compare it to a projected national GHG emission by a target year, basically expressed with respect to projected emissions if no actions additional to those already being implemented are taken to limit the emissions. For targets that have strategies, plans, and actions, in targets that are expressed basically as a specific strategy or specific strategies and policies, etc. The targets basically consist of adopting and implementing these policies. And they don't necessarily have a specific GHG emission reduction goal. Some of them have, but if these strategies don't have a quantified emission reduction specified, countries could use relevant qualitative indicators like share of renewable energy, sectoral energy efficiency improvement shares, average efficiency of road vehicles could also be an example. I mean, there could be many examples depending on what kind of policies and actions. But although, I mean, need to remember that countries are also encouraged to move towards economy-wide emission reduction targets over time. Lastly, targets involving mitigation co-benefits of adaptation actions or economic diversification plans, policies, and measures. And they can involve a variety of indicators based on the envisioned activities. So economic diversification plans in the context of climate change usually refers to two concepts. It's strategies aimed at increasing economic resilience by shifting away from vulnerable products, markets, and jobs towards low emission and climate resilient income sources. So it can be countries that are very reliant on oil exports, trying to shifting away to diversify their economic profile. That would also imply that you would have a more climate-friendly profile, probably. And the second is measures aimed at reducing the adverse impact of the implementation of climate change mitigation policies that have cross-border effects. And this is specifically relevant for countries which economies are concentrated on few products, services, and sectors, and those which products, services, and sectors also rely on expected future drop in consumption as a result of mitigation measures in other countries. So that could also be for countries that are very reliant on oil exports. So if the expectation is that oil consumption will decrease because of other countries' mitigation measures, then it's a plan to take that into consideration and diversify the economy. An example of indicators here could be hectares of reforestation, percentage of renewable energy use of production. Some apply carbon neutrality or share non-fossil fuel in primary energy consumption. It can be a lot of other non-GHG related indicators as well. So in addition to the target and indicator values, countries also required to describe each methodology and or accounting approach used to define the targets, the baselines, and each indicator. So that includes like things like key parameters, assumptions, definitions, data sources, model used, which IPCC guidelines and metrics used. Basically, it's in addition to the whole information that needs to be provided, also the whole background assumption and methodology work behind the data needs to be provided as well. and also how the methodology in each reporting year is consistent with the methodologies used when communicating NDCs as well. Potential inconsistency with the National Inventory report, if any, and also like how double counting of net emission reduction has been avoided. Some of these aspects are things that you would recognize from conventional reporting, but this is more related into the NDC and the forward-looking aspects of the current reporting. So here, actually, the methodologies also become very relevant because the methodologies used can have an impact of your projections. So, and all this information needs to be provided in a structured summary as well, including contribution from land use and land use change and forestry sector for each year of the target period or target year, if not included in the inventory time series of the total net GHG emissions and removals. And this summary is to be provided in a narrative and tabular format. We don't have that format yet, and we expect to have it in November 2020. So by then we will have a clear indication of basically the table of contents of this information to be provided, and also the structure of it in the tables. And also, again, very important, countries participating in cooperative approaches that involve the ITMOs are also required to provide annual emissions by sources and removal by sinks covered by the NDC, and also a balance reflecting the level of emissions adding transferred ITMOs or subtracting ITMOs. So between this slide and the previous, you can see that the information requested on NDC tracking is quite extensive. But this is also one of the central parts of the MPGs and an important element of the transparency framework for the Paris Agreement in general. So this is also where we would expect a lot of information requested. So many NDCs have also included policies and measures of part of their mitigation contribution, or as a contributing factor to the mitigation contribution. And the information on these policies and measures is also requested in order to track NDC progress. So again, a lot of information here, and I'll take you through it step by step. So for these actions, policies, and measures, countries are requested to provide estimates of expected and achieved emission reductions for all of these actions, policies, or measures listed, and also the methodologies and assumptions used to estimate the emission reductions by each action's policy and measure. So the previous section was on the targets themselves and indicators to track the implementation and achievement of the targets, which would in many cases involve one indicator. And here we talk about each specific action, which also needs to be tracked. So these policies also include adaptation actions and economic diversification plans, which are listed or included in as a part of the NDC and NDC targets. And this information is actually reported in national communication and the annual update reports on the current reporting framework, but although not the same level of detail of the information is requested. The parties must include a descriptive information, and we also provide information on non-GHG benefits, which is not a shall requirement. I mean, you can see here in the table there are some flexibility, some may requirements, and non-GHG mitigation benefits is not a shall requirement, is a may requirement, but we know from our work with countries that aligning the assessment of impacts of policies and actions, not only for GHG emission, but also non-GHG related indicators, but indicators, for instance, related to the SDGs, is a big priority for a lot of countries. So if countries are doing this work already, they might just as well provide this information. It's also good information to have structured for the country itself. So flexibility in this specific area of information is allowed for countries with limited capacity, but it is suggested that countries currently working on or planning to produce a new or revised NDC or national communication or BUR before 2020. This is not something coming out on a negotiation. This is us providing our own ideas. Should consider to gradually enhance and align the reporting requirements on current work, on convention reporting, to the alignment of the BTR requested information. That would help you in this years before the first BTR has to be submitted to basically prepare yourself for the requirements of the BTR. So if you know that you have this information scattered around somewhere, which is not collected on a recurrent basis and centralized in a central data repository, you can start to consider how you could make these arrangements happen. So the summary of GHG emissions and removals is a reporting element currently under negotiation, and the proposed format will be known also by the end of 2020. It's mostly relevant for countries that submit a national inventory report as a standalone report to the BTR. So if you have included the national inventory report, you will have the inventory and the summary already in the BTR, so this will not be. And the last section on the information to track progress on NDCs is information on projections on GHG emissions and removals, which oddly enough will only be indicative and not be used by the reviewing arrangements of the Enhanced Transparency Framework to assess NDC progress and achievements, and it's not mandatory for developing countries. So parties are basically required to provide projections, and developing countries is not mandatory for developing countries, just need to reiterate that. So projections of GHG emissions and removals, countries which, I know that a lot of countries actually do this kind of exercises in their national communications or other reporting. So some countries might have this information already. And if you have some information, you're also encouraged to report it and basically say that this information that you have and that you will work for improvements over time. So it's not that since it's not required, you shouldn't provide it. If you have some information, you're more than welcome to provide it in your reporting. You're also allowed to limit projection until the end point of the NDC, so not following all the requirements of the years and the time coverage, etc. But according to the MPGs, the requirements is that projections are to extend at least 15 years beyond the next year ending in 0 or 5. Basically means that if the most recent NIR, the GHG inventory, is the one presenting values for 2024, the projections in the BTR should reach 16 years all the way into 2040. For an NIR with values for 2026, the projections presented in the BTR should reach 19 years into 2045. And these scenarios will have to include what they call a with measures scenario of all GHG emissions and removals. And they can also include, or as in the language of the MPGs, it says may include with additional measures or without measures scenarios. So projections of the emissions and removals are basically meant to provide quantitative information of the impact of mitigation policies and measures. So the with measure scenario requires a projection of all GHG emissions and removals, including currently implemented and adopted policies and measures. And the optional scenarios to be reported, the with additional measures, is a projection including implemented, adopted, and planned policies and measures. And the without measures projection is basically excluding all policies and measures implemented, adopted, and planned. They need to be presented in a graphical and tabular format, so both in tables and projections, as the earlier slide, and with and without LULUCF, and include projections by sectors and by gas, as well as cumulative at national level, using a common metric consistent with one used in the inventory, and also have projections of key indicators to determine progress towards NDCs. So a lot of work actually goes into projections. Some countries have done it for the last communications. Some countries haven't. Also, yeah, of course, always describe methodologies used for the projections, underlying assumptions, which models, potential changes, if there have been changes to the methods used, etc. So this seems like quite a mouthful and a lot of information to be provided, but there are methods and methodologies out there that can be used, and also there are peer-to-peer initiatives by the UNFCCC that can be used to ask about experiences that other countries have gone through in doing these projections. But basically, I mean, it's kind of an exercise that reminds a lot of the GHG inventory. This is just a table of a GHG inventory, and it's the same information that is requested both in table format and in graphic formats, but not looking into the past, looking into the future. So I will jump over the section on climate change impacts and adaptation, which is chapter 4 of the MPGs, because Mirko will actually get back to it later when talking about adaptation communications. So here I'll talk about the information required on support needed and received. And reporting on support needed and received in the BTR is a should requirement for developing countries, so it's not mandatory. And also, we need to remember that the MPGs also provide information on support provided and mobilized, but this is information only relevant or required by developed countries. So we're not covering this in this presentation, where we here focus on the reporting requirements for developing countries. But of course, if any developing country is providing support, they are of course encouraged to report this information as well. So information on support needed and received is requested both in textual and tabular formats. On the table you see here, the columns to the right have some initials, basically representing different categories of information. FN stands for financial support needed, FR, financial support received, TDTN, technology development and transfer support needed, TDTR, technology development and transfer support received, CBN, capacity building support needed, CBR, capacity building support received, and ST is basically support needed and received for transparency activities, specifically under Article 13. The table basically illustrates the kind of information requested for each category in tabular format. And some information is common for all, some is not. And I mean, it's basic information about the program, description, which channel, recipient entity, implementation entity, type of technology, etc., etc., etc. On the information requested in textual formats, on the financial support needed, countries should provide information on the sectors for which the parties wishes to attract international finance, existing barriers to attract international finance, and a description of how the support will contribute to the NDC and long-term goals of the Paris Agreements. And on technology development and transfer support needs, countries should report on plans, needs, and priorities, and including those identified in the technology needs assessments, the TNAs that a lot of countries have undertaken, and also technology development and transfer needs for the enhancement of endogenous capacities and technologies in the countries. On the capacity building side, countries should describe the approach it seeks to take to enhance capacity building support, capacity building needs, constraints, and gaps in communicating needs as well. Also on how the support needed will improve the provision of the information and the process of enhancing public awareness, public participation, and access to information. On technology development and transport support, basic countries should provide information on existing case studies, key success and failure stories, and countries should also report on how the support contributes to technology development and transfer. Finally, I mean, when reporting on information on support needed and received for the implementation of Article 13, countries should provide information to prepare the reports and for addressing the areas for improvement identified by technical expert reviews that will come after the submission of the BTRs. And probably activities like CBIT and ICAT will be listed under this sort of reporting. And again, underlying the need to provide the underlying assumptions, definition, and methodologies. I'd say that all this information that is to be provided is not only a requirement, but I stress that for countries to report support needed, it provides a window out to the international community to attract support. And when providing information on support received, I think, I mean, partially a shame that it's not a shall requirement, because that would have given the international community to compare the reporting from developing countries and developed countries and see if there are actually discrepancies between the support provided and support received. But anyway, I will now give the word over to Mirko, who will go through the information requested for relevant climate change impacts and adaptation.
Thank you, Federico. So I will now cover the last two boxes, and I'm thinking you are pretty tired of seeing this figure. It's the last time you're going to see it, I promise. So now we move indeed to analyze the requirements concerning number 1, adaptation communication, and number 2, the information related to climate change impacts and adaptation, which should be submitted as part of the BTR. So it might be appropriate actually to start off by explaining why we address these two topics together. And that is because, as we will see, there are definitely some links between the adaptation communication and these information on climate change impacts and adaptation as part of the BTR. And actually, while for the information for climate change impacts and adaptation, the MPGs are quite specific, we cannot say the same for the current guidance on adaptation communication. So we try to consider these two topics together before closing off with the presentation. Starting with the purpose of the adaptation communication, this is to increase the visibility and profile of adaptation in its balance and its balance with mitigation, strengthen the adaptation actions and support for developing countries, provide input to the global stocktake, and finally, enhancing learning and understanding of adaptation needs and actions. In terms of submissions, under the Paris Agreement, parties can decide to submit adaptation communications as a component of or in conjunction with other communication or documents, and these includes national adaptation plans, nationally determined contribution, and national communications. In addition to this, the MPGs adopted at COP24, they state that the parties have now the choice to submit their adaptation communication in conjunction also with the BTR. As you can see in the figure here, basically these are the 4 different reporting vehicles that can be used to submit adaptation communication. And you have on the extreme right of the figure, the global stocktake, which is the final endpoint. So talking now about information to report, yes, information about reporting in the adaptation communication. The MPGs do not provide any guidance on the information that has to be included in such a report. And this kind of requirements are actually found instead in this decision that you see here, decision 9, which is also from COP24 and is the decision on adaptation communication specifically. And this provides this list of information which may be included. And we can go through it just very quickly. This is national circumstances again, then impacts, risk and vulnerabilities, national adaptation priorities, strategies, policies, plans, goals, and so on. And the list is not finished here. There is other 7 or something like this points. In addition to, actually, maybe we need to specify that this decision, so the decision 9, states that this information that we just presented may be used when submitting adaptation communication as part of the NDC, and nothing is explicitly said on the specific requirements for submissions as part of BTR or national communication. There is another important decision in this sense, which is this decision 17 from COP8, which states that in their national communication, countries may provide information on measures to mitigate climate change and measures to facilitate adaptation. And it provides these 4 bullet points that you see in the slide, which are groups of information, again, which could be considered when reporting on adaptation communication. Next bullet point is that draft supplementary guidance is actually going to be available, and this is expected by June 2022. And this is currently being drawn up by the Adaptation Committee in cooperation with the IPCC Working Group number 2. And yes, so hopefully by 22, we will have some more guidance on this. The last point is that so there is lack of guidance in this sense, and that's why we also suggest that countries could make use of the information listed by the MPGs under the climate change impacts and adaptation chapters to compile their adaptation communication. And this could be done in addition with these guidance that we have seen, that we can see in this slide. Why do we think this? We think that this could be done because adopting this approach when preparing an adaptation communication, especially before 2024, can help countries to get ready for submissions of information as part of the BTR and ensure that reports are consistent with each other. So what are these information to be reported in the BTR on climate change impacts and adaptation? We see it in this slide, and the MPGs are actually quite detailed in this sense. However, all reporting requirements in terms of climate change impacts and adaptations are also should requirements or may. And these information is structured in the following blocks that you see in the slide: national circumstances, impacts, risk, and vulnerabilities, and so on. So actually here we have something from the publication that we have just released, and this is to come back to what we were saying just before about the possibility of using the MPG's guidance for adaptation communication, which is more specific than the current guidance on AC. And you can see here there are 3 columns with 3 different types of decisions and their relevant requirements. So if you're curious about exploring more how the requirements differ with each other and how you could go about it, if you are developing an adaptation communication, you can check the publication which is now available. So to recap, finally, what we have discussed in these 2 webinars, we have started with presenting the transition to the Paris Agreement and the enhanced transparency framework role into this. We have done this by showing the connection between the information that will be reported in the ETF and the different articles of the Paris Agreement, if you remember from the previous webinar. We hope you attended it. And then we have provided an overview of the main features of the ETF, including the timeline of its realization. And in this webinar especially, we have moved more into the biannual transparency report and how the MPGs for transparency, they describe in details what information will go into it. And again, in this last webinar, we have looked at all these blocks of information that you see here, and we have analyzed how the requirements basically have changed and what they are and so on. So the take-home messages, finally. The first one is that the MPGs contain more detailed guidelines on information to be reported compared to the previous framework. And then that the National Inventory report and the information to track NDC progress are the ones that are mandatory to report. And following, we have that even though the first BTR will be submitted in 2024, the MPGs still provide some information which is linked to, for example, NDC requirements and other current submissions. So we believe that preparing NDCs or other reports taking into account the MPGs could help countries to identify gaps and ensure that the necessary information will be available when the ETF will become effective. And lastly, basically this is a last summary, which is that apart from LDCs and seeds which have these exception of in terms of submission and the flexibility provision for developing countries that we have seen, there is this common reporting, and basically how the flexibility works is that it still gives countries that need less stringent requirements the option to omit certain information because of their capacities. But nevertheless, as we have underlined, the need for flexibility will need to be explained, and countries will have to come up with basically plans on how to overcome these needs. And we hope that in this way, together with the emphasis on the creation and improvement of national systems for transparency, basically the MPGs will end up providing the framework for moving towards a common and improved mode of reporting for all parties. And I think this is the final message that we have for today, and the final slide as well. So we open now the floor for questions, and we will do our best to answer them.
So you can see that some questions have started taking in. So we'll try to our best ability to answer as many as we can. There is a question here. Are there resources or references that you recommend for examples of indicators for tracking different NDC policies, strategies, and plans? Are there indicators that are most common or best practice? I think there are a wide range of references that can be used, and the one that I have the most confidence with is because I've been working with ICAT projects, is the ICAT guidance documents that basically provide a process for assessing policies. It's not all policies, but some policies in some sectors, but they can provide a good indication of indicators for different policies. I mean, when it comes to emissions, tons of CO2 equivalents would usually be the indicator, but of course that is dependent on the kind of activities that you will implement. So sometimes you need to actually go back to other methodologies. So you structure it with, you combine it with IPCC methodologies, or you combine it with CDM methodologies to find relevant methods, including a description of the indicators to track. So I would say that the ICAT methodologies can give you a good insight in the process when doing an assessment of policies, and then combining it with, for example, CDM methodologies, you would have like a good set of tools to start from.
Yeah, I think I can actually take maybe the next question, which is about if we could explain what is the difference between absolute emission reductions and reduction below a baseline. I think the difference is between actually absolute emissions, so targets that are about absolute emissions. So you look at what are the emission basically sinks and sources, and from this you calculate what is the absolute emissions, so either positive or negative, so sequestration or emissions, and these are the absolute ones. And that's, for example, when we talk about the footprint, the carbon footprint of a country or a product and so on. And on the other hand, we have these reductions, and reductions are normally relative emissions. So you have the absolute emission and relative emissions. So when we talk reductions, we always talk about emissions below a baseline. So you have the projections, and then you have these relative emission reductions, I think.
Or to put it in other words, when we talk about NDC targets, it's countries that have said that in 1990, my emissions were at this level, and by 2025, I will reduce them by this much compared to the 1990 level. That's an absolute emission reduction. Reductions below a baseline or business as usual scenario is basically saying, we assume that with current trends, my emissions in the future will be this much. So in 2025, I will probably emit this much, and I will reduce my emissions compared to what I think I would have emitted otherwise in the future. So that's, the one is based on real numbers that we know, and the second one is based on future assumptions. So that's the temporal aspect of it. Which developing countries would be considered best practices for emission projections? That's a very, very good question, and partially also politically loaded. I cannot say which ones are actually the best practices, because I don't know all of them. I don't know if you have some ideas, Mirko, but actually, I know that a country like Chile has done some very good exercises on emission projections. Actually, a country like Mauritius, which is a totally different kind of country, has done some great work in their third national communication on emission projections. So this is just examples I can come to think of just.
Yeah, I just thought about also Costa Rica, which has developed this decarbonization plan, and they have looked until 2050 and drawing projections on how they will be basically carbon neutral in this half of the century. So definitely there is some interesting things to look at when it comes to also Costa Rica as an example. Yeah.
I think also Mexico has done, that I know of previously, some great projection exercises on a sectoral basis. So I haven't seen or updated myself on national projections, but just to say that there are different countries, are very different kinds of countries as well that have done great exercises, but sometimes it depends on priorities in the country, sometimes it depends on projects that they have participated in.
Then we have one question, which is about if basically the IPCC guidelines have to be approved by the COP before being used, and if the IPCC 2018, for example, has already been approved or should be approved before being used. And the answer is yes. I mean, before the IPCC guidelines are considered as possible to use for the BTR or the inventories, yes, they need to be approved. I actually don't know if the IPCC 2019 has been approved already. We should check it out. Yeah, but thanks for the question.
Well, there is a question if the presentations will be available, and yes, they will be available on our UNEP-DTU partnership website. It's unepdtu.org, and I don't remember the exact link extension, but you will have to navigate in the website. There shouldn't be too hard to find.
Yeah, probably there is only one UNEP-DTU, so probably that's us.
There is a question on further guidance on the application of the MPGs, and basically saying that a lot of developing countries might not have the resources and capacities and might not be used to do the work behind submitting reports like BTRs and inventories. So how could the UNEP-DTU partnership and ICAT and other players provide a sort of step-by-step guide or tool to help putting developing countries on track of enhancing reporting? That's a very good question. I think there is a lot of transparency related guidance that it is coming out. We are part of it. The tricky part is that transparency is like an all-encompassing animal. So there are several ways to go about it, right? And there are several elements that form part of a robust transparency system. But I mean, you usually will have to look at how the data is generated. And to look at that for inventories, you need to look at the IPCC guidance. There's a lot of guiding material to the application of ICC guidance, so I will not go through it now because there is information out there, and the UNFCCC has done a great work on providing guidance on inventory making. But then it's the whole question about how you structure yourself internally in a country in order to make this happen. And it's actually a lot of the institutional arrangements that you create between the institutions, and how do you agree on the relevant information that the institution can share between each other, who has the responsibility to do it, when, how do you store and collect it, and how do you make it available. So these are all things that are kind of country specific and depends a little bit on the national circumstances. Like in some countries, you can see that you have very strong national statistic institutes, which are used to do some of the work on the inventory and have a foot into the work of a lot of other data, and they are central for this kind of work. In other countries, the Ministry of Environment with the climate change section is very strong, and they take the lead on it and then engage with the others. In other countries, you actually have legislation that requires the other ministries to report the relevant information to the central institution, being the Ministry of Environment or other, to report a specific set of information periodically. So, I mean, the approach varies from country to country, and making one comprehensive and short step-by-step guidance, I think is, if you would have the recipe on how to make it, I would be very happy to receive it.
Yeah, I think it's a great idea.
But I think, I mean, it's a step-by-step guidance that describes all the steps and processes in detail. That's kind of impossible. But guidance in order of organizing processes, etc., I think it will be there sooner or later, related to the MPGs.
Yeah, I like also the idea of these being, of course, it's learning by doing exercise when you work on developing such systems. And probably there are some common lessons that you learn from the work across countries that are actually common, even though the contexts are different. So I think it's a good idea. Thanks for the question, and I think we will think about it as well.
I can see there was a question about RED Plus and RED Plus actions that used to be reported or had to be reported in a technical annex to the BOR. Will this be the same for the BTR? I actually might have to get back to you on that, because I remember reading up on it. I just don't remember the exact answer, but I think so. That's my short question. So I don't see any more questions coming in at the moment. So I think this is it from us then. Thank you so much for all those of you that have stayed until the end. The others missed out on the good question and answer sessions. Thank you again for participating and taking interest. And we hope to interact with you again for upcoming webinars. We will also do our best to update the information when we receive more information, like common reporting tables and so on. So hopefully you will hear from us as well in the future. Thank you once again from Federico from Copenhagen.
And Mirko, thank you very much. And also to add, please let us know how it was. I think you have feedback templates. So yes, please let us know how it was. And yeah, see you soon to the next one.